Welcome to this presentation of the Rotary Club of North Bethesda, Maryland, USA. Our club was established in 1974. We meet every Friday morning at 7:45 a.m., and we often invite guest speakers to give presentations on all kinds of interesting subjects. Please contact us through our website at nbrotary.org. And thanks for watching.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have the distinct pleasure to introduce Jessica Foley, who is a PhD and is Managing Director and Chief Scientific Officer for the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, whose mission is to accelerate the development and adoption of focused ultrasound, a breakthrough non-invasive therapeutic medical technology. Prior to the foundation, she spent several years in the medical device industry, and was AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen of the North Bethesda Rotary Club, please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Jessica Foley.
Thanks, Nick, and for the invitation through our neighborhood listserv. So it's great. I live in the area. I live in the Wingate neighborhood right across from the NIH main campus. So anyway, it's nice to meet all of you. And I'll talk today about Focused Ultrasound. I work at the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. We're a nonprofit foundation. We're based in Charlottesville, Virginia, but I live here, obviously. And I've been in the Focused Ultrasound field for many, many years, back from my days of getting my PhD out in Seattle in this field, and then working in one of the companies that's leading the way in this field and developing devices, and then heading to the foundation. So if you want to start the slides, I'll share with you about Focused Ultrasound, and then a little bit about our foundation, and feel free to ask questions whenever you have them. So if you want to just go to the second slide. So imagine a patient with a brain tumor, malignant brain tumor like a glioblastoma, which typically there are not very good treatments for. But imagine you could be treated, that patient could be treated with sound energy. So sound in addition to or instead of more conventional forms of therapy like surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, immunotherapy. And imagine then that though that treatment doesn't have the side effects that you're used to with cancer treatments, and it could maybe not save the patient's life at this state, but could extend their life or give them improved quality of life. And, it sounds like it's science fiction, but it's actually very real. Today, there are several trials going on around the world using focused ultrasound in combination with chemotherapy and or immunotherapy to treat brain tumors. And I'll talk to you more about a lot of other applications. But this is kind of what we're building towards, non-invasive treatments with less side effects, hopefully less costly than other treatments for a wide variety of pretty much untreatable diseases. So if you go to the next slide. So focused ultrasound is a revolutionary, non-invasive therapeutic technology. So it could be an alternative or a complement to surgery, radiation, drug delivery, immunotherapy. And because of that, it has the potential to really transform treatment of many clinical applications, and also ultimately transform patient lives. If you go to the next slide. And because it's non-invasive, that's really where the big advantages are. So in most cases, it's an outpatient procedure. There's no incisions, which means less pain, also limited or no need for post-procedure pain meds like opioids. Decreased complications, things like infection, again, because of with no cutting, and it leads to a more rapid recovery, improving outcomes, as well as lowering cost for treatment. Next slide. And this slide really best demonstrates the power of focused ultrasound. So this is a gentleman with essential tremor. So essential tremor is kind of a cousin to Parkinson's, but the main symptom is really the tremor. And it can be for some individuals debilitating. So you can see here, it's very difficult for him to move these jelly beans from one container to another. So this is very disruptive of his life. This man actually was an architect who had to stop working because of this. So you can flip through to the next one. You'll see how difficult it is for him to draw right before the procedure. He can't stay in the lines. Then if you click the next, this is a MRI image of the brain, and you can see the blue dot in the center. That's the area of the brain that's causing the tremor. And if you go to the next one, this is representative of 1,000 different beams of ultrasound converging at that spot deep in the brain. So the ultrasound is coming from outside of the brain and converging at the spot inside the brain. And at that point where the beams converge, you can get high temperatures to cause disruption of those cells. So you can actually kill those cells that are misfiring and causing that tremor. So if you go to the next, you'll see the spot where the red arrow is, the dark spot. That's the small region that was needed to be treated. And that's the only part of the brain that was treated with the ultrasound. And then if you click next, the next two you can click at the same time. So you can see that how easy he can draw. And then after about a few weeks after the procedure at his follow-up, how easily he can move the jelly beans from one container to another. So obviously this is a very dramatic effect. This was a trial that started at the University of Virginia about 9 or so years ago. And now this application of essential tremor is approved by the FDA and covered by Medicare all over the country. That took a long time to get there, and the foundation was very instrumental in getting this there, from funding. Yep.
It's like, how lasting is that?
So for some patients, this has been lasting 5+ years for them. I mean, it's still a early treatment in terms of how long this has been done. So following up patients, we only have maybe 5.
How long is he still feeling? Does he have to undergo continuing?
No, he doesn't. Yeah,
And
he doesn't. Yeah.
Stay cured.
Yeah, and that's the goal. I mean, you have to kind of that's the goal, is that it would be a one-time treatment, but you could treat again if you felt like you needed to. There's nothing to preclude you from treating again. It's not like you have doses of radiation or something in the brain and you have this cumulative dose. It's just the ultrasound. So you could go in if some diseases, not essential tremor so much, but say Parkinson's is a progressive disorder. So you may in fact need to treat patients down the road again, but again, they might prefer that. Some patients would prefer that than the alternative of like a deep brain stimulation where they have the device in their brain. So it's really that this is now providing an alternative to people who maybe wouldn't want some of those more invasive treatments.
Could I ask one
Yep.
technical question?
Yep.
Okay, so you mentioned that what it's doing, the beam is increasing the temperature around the cells,
Mhm.
killing them. Is it inducing apoptosis? Is that what it's doing?
So in
Red cell death?
it could, in this case, it's necrosis, but it could induce apoptosis. The ultrasound actually has many different ways in which it can interact with the tissue. And I'll kind of touch on a few of the other ones, but yes, there in some cases it can induce apoptosis. Yep.
Jessica.
Yep.
Different between this one, type 1, is it doing something?
The what?
The red bracelet. The band.
Oh, I don't know. It's not doing anything. I don't know if that's like I don't know what that red bracelet is, but no, that's not part of the treatment. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. Oh.
So a good friend of mine had some DBS, the deep brain stimulation.
Yeah.
The jury's still out. It's been a couple of months and he's not really significantly improved. Could this be done now, post DBS?
So potentially, I'm not sure where it is in the when it's initially kind of approved by the FDA, it would be for patients who hadn't had DBS, but I know there have been some clinical trials in patients that have had DBS, so I don't know where we stand yet. I'd be happy to follow up on that. But theoretically, yes, we should be able to have a point where patients who've had DBS and it's failed could get this instead. So some of it just depends on the FDA is obviously very strict initially on sometimes the approval of things. And they want to make sure that the brain hasn't had all sorts of other stuff in it when they do this treatment. So, but yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great application, essential tremor. There's a lot of other neurological applications I'll mention. There's also a lot of cancer applications. So this is showing a patient with pancreatic cancer. The yellow circle showing a big tumor. Post-treatment, it's dark. Again, that's showing that the cells are dead. And then over time, the necrosed tissue just sort of resorbs and then also filters out of the body. That's why the mass is smaller at the end there. But what's interesting on the next slide is that in this clinical trial that was done in Italy, they found in a handful of patients that metastatic tumors actually decreased in size. So the ultrasound was only applied to the primary tumor in the pancreas, but metastatic tumors all over the body decreased in size. So that's indicating there's some sort of a systemic response, an immune response that's happening. And that has kind of led to an entire field of study, which the foundation is really supporting a lot. And that is looking at ultrasound primarily in combination with immunotherapies to have a more pronounced effect. So if you know anything about immunotherapies, you know that they work really well in some patients and in other patients, they don't work at all. So the whole field of immunotherapy is trying to figure out why and how do we pair different drugs together. So in this case, you could potentially pair ultrasound with a drug like a Keytruda, a checkpoint inhibitor, and have maybe, again, with less side effects, a more robust treatment for more patients. So that's a whole other area. So if you move to the next slide, how does it work? I kind of mentioned this, the beams converging. So it's similar to rays of sunlight focusing through a magnifying glass and on a point on a leaf and burning a hole in a leaf. If you go to the next slide, but in this case, we'd be targeting something deep in the body, a tumor, or the area in the brain causing the tremor. And what's unique about the ultrasound versus other energy modalities is that you don't damage anything as you're moving through the tissue. So the ultrasound source is outside of the body as it goes through skin, bone, muscle, fat. It's not damaging any of that. Only at the point where the beams converge will you get that profound effect. So if you go to the next slide.
Which is heat, right?
Heat, or I'll tell you there's some other things too, but heat is the primary one. That's where most of the work has been done. And there's a sharp demarcation between treated and untreated tissue, which you can see here. It's only about 1/10 of a millimeter, which is really important, particularly in places like the brain where you have sensitive structures all around and you only want to damage the one area. So the next slide. But there are many other biological effects that can happen in the tissue. So some of the major ones are obviously the destroying of the tissue, which can be done with the heating. Ultrasound is also a mechanical wave. And so as it goes in the tissue, it can produce different pressures. And so there's actually a way of applying the ultrasound, which will mechanically kind of disrupt the tissue. It'll actually mechanically like liquefy the tissue. So that's another way of destroying tissue. Then there's all sorts of ways of doing drug delivery. So you can make cell membranes or other membranes in the body more permeable to drugs for a short period of time. And this time you wouldn't be trying to heat the tissue. You'd be using the mechanical effects of ultrasound to kind of pop little holes in the cell membrane that would allow drugs to, go in, or genes or things like that. And then there's just different ways of modulating nerve cells, or as I mentioned, the immune effects. So there's a whole host of things you can do with this. Next slide. And so I'll just flash through those. So I mentioned the thermal ablation, and then histotripsy is this mechanical disruption of cells. Next slide. A really interesting application is drug delivery. So obviously, usually in the case of chemotherapy, drugs go throughout the body and can have toxicity effects that are undesirable. So if you go to the next slide, what you could do with ultrasound is you could take something called a microbubble, also things like liposomes that are, very small as compared to red blood cells. Next slide. And you can load them with chemotherapy agents, genes, growth factors. And as they're loaded into those microbubbles, they're not having any effect as they travel through the body. Next slide. So you could inject a bunch of those through the body. They're not having an effect, but then you could apply, if you go to the next slide, you could apply the ultrasound, say to the liver, if there's like a liver tumor, and only, so here they are going throughout the liver. If you go to the next slide, if you apply to the tumor, only where the ultrasound is applied, those microbubbles pop open and release the drug. So it becomes a localized way of delivering chemotherapy or other types of drugs. So
that's used today?
it's in preclinical. It's not yet in clinical trials. There are some similar things, and actually there are some clinical trials, but not in the U.S. So it's coming, but it's not there yet.
I have a neighbor who has cancer in her liver.
Okay, yeah. So that, I mean, this would be ideally something that would be able to be used for many different drugs, and in many different parts of the body. Next slide. And then the blood-brain barrier is another thing. So if you don't know what the blood-brain barrier is, it's basically a thick lining of cells that are inside blood vessels in the brain. And that's really to protect bad things from getting into the brain, toxins, viruses, things like that. But it can also many times prevent therapeutics from getting into the brain. They're too large to get through the pores in the blood-brain barrier. So what the ultrasound can do, again, with the mechanical effects, is it can, again, with these microbubbles, it can oscillate these microbubbles, and they push on the inside of the blood vessels, and they push open cells that are in that blood-brain barrier. So they essentially create little holes in the blood-brain barrier for a few hours, and drugs can get in. So there are several clinical trials in this for glioblastoma, for Alzheimer's, for Huntington's, for ALS. And so that's a big area of research as well. Next slide. That's actually what this is showing. So it's showing this oscillating microbubble, and then you can see like little tiny drug particles going through. So, and then the blood-brain barrier repairs itself after several hours. So it's back to the normal way of protecting the brain. Next slide. And then I mentioned the immunomodulation, where, tumors are really good at camouflaging themselves from the immune system, and ultrasound can help to destroy that camouflage. And particularly combined with immunotherapy drugs, it could be a powerful way of treating a lot of cancers. Next slide. So all of these applications, you're not meant to be able to read this chart. So there are now over 170 different clinical applications of focused ultrasound that are in various stages of development. And this is globally. So this is something, as the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, we track this. We're funding projects and clinical trials in a lot of these areas. But the big kind of buckets of applications are neurological applications. Again, things like Tremor, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, brain tumors, various other things. And then cancers. There's also a lot of women's health and men's health applications, things like prostate cancer. So prostate cancer is one of the ones that's been cleared by the FDA for many years. And then uterine fibroids is something for women that's been cleared by the FDA for many years. But there's a lot of room for improvement. So on this chart, what we would want is we would want to see all of these different clinical applications go out to that blue purple arrow. That would indicate that they've been approved by the FDA and they're reimbursed through Medicare or private insurers here in the US. But you can see there's only a few of them that have reached that point. And that's because it's obviously just a long road from a new idea, one, to FDA approval, but then beyond. Was that a question?
No.
Oh, okay. But even beyond FDA approval, there sometimes can be years before something is approved through Medicare or private insurers. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do as our foundation as well, is break down those barriers to make sure that these treatments can get to all patients as quickly as possible. Next slide. So that's what I was just describing, this really complicated and inefficient process to get from new idea to widespread patient acceptance or application. So next slide. And so that's what we're trying to do as a foundation, is break down those barriers and also work with this complex ecosystem of organizations that are within this medical, biomedical ecosystem. So obviously you have the government entities, you have academia, you have industry, you have patients, providers, and then you have a lot of other foundations, disease-specific foundations that we work a lot with. And so as a foundation, we're trying to work with all of these organizations to help speed the growth and acceptance of focused ultrasound. Next slide. So I just kind of highlighted some of these impediments, but I think biggest things, obviously awareness, talking, I'm sure none of you have heard of focused ultrasound before now. And it's out there and it's been out there, but most patients are not familiar with it, and most physicians are not familiar with it as well. So that's a big hurdle, is just trying to raise that awareness. And then also, as I mentioned, these approvals, regulatory insurance approvals, and then figuring out, even beyond that, how do you make sure that all patients have access to it? Because right now, it's it's only in kind of bigger medical centers. So if patients live in rural places or not able to get to those medical centers, they also have difficulty getting access to this. Next slide. So when our founder, who's a former neurosurgeon from the University of Virginia, when he kind of thought about or heard about focused ultrasound and saw all these challenges, didn't really know how are we going to, looked about how can we solve this. And if you click through, so that's where the impetus for the foundation came, was, nobody else is really looking at this technology. So we should create an organization that actually is devoted to advancing this technology. Next slide. So that's where the foundation came from. We started in 2006, as I mentioned, based in Charlottesville. And we're the catalyst to accelerate the development and adoption of focused ultrasound. Next slide. And we do a lot of things, but above all, we're really trying to, influence the direction of the field. There's all these different clinical applications. We identify where there's critical unmet clinical needs. So obviously things like Alzheimer's, glioblastoma, pancreatic cancer, these areas where there are not a lot of good treatments or there are no treatments at all. And we try to move the field to address those through giving out funding. Obviously, we're like a disease foundation, we're giving out funding to fund various types of projects and clinical trials. And then we're also trying to get our community to work with a sense of urgency and to work collaboratively. So we bring people together in workshops and symposia and try to get people, collaborating so that we can move forward faster together. Next slide. And that's kind of what this is just showing, is just fostering collaboration. Next slide. So the biggest thing we are doing is funding research. That's about 60% of our budget. Right now, we have about 95 different projects. And we're, funding mostly academic institutions, but we partner a lot with foundations to do that and provide some funding to manufacturers if it's just very early stage research. But you can see at the bottom some of our big areas of emphasis are brain applications, cancer and cancer immunotherapy. And those are kind of the big areas. Next slide. And I mentioned we, bring people together. We actually every 2 years have a international symposium on focused ultrasound that's always held in the DC area. So this last year it was held at the other Marriott in Bethesda, the big one. And so that's a great meeting, bringing people from all over the world to talk about focused ultrasound. And we have a lot of other workshops. Next slide. And we fund a lot of internships and fellowships and those sorts of things to try to cultivate the next generation of researchers in focused ultrasound. We just started a new program called Access FUS, which is around getting folks from underrepresented and underserved populations into focused ultrasound research. So that we hope is going to, expand the diversity of our field as well. But you can just see here, we've, funded many, many interns at this point. Next slide. And we have a website and a newsletter and webinars. So if you're interested, you can go to www.fussfoundation.org and you can sign up for our newsletter and you can learn, all about the stuff that's going on in Focused Ultrasound. Next slide. And then we fund a lot of centers of excellence. So there's some that are near here, obviously in our backyard, both Children's National and University of Maryland are centers of excellence. So they have a lot of work going on there. In fact, Maryland just released, they were the leaders on a multi-site trial that led to the FDA approval for Parkinson's disease, treatment of Parkinson's disease. And so they just published a big article in the New England Journal of Medicine on that trial. So there's a lot of work going on in this area. Next slide. And, as a foundation, we're always trying to raise awareness. So that's what I'm doing here today, to try to get more people to know what's going on in Focused Ultrasound, also to learn about the foundation. Next slide. And we do that to the media as well. There was a great piece that Sanjay Gupta did just about a month or so ago, which if any of you are interested, I can get somebody the link, but it was a really interesting story following a woman who had essential tremor, following her from before her treatment until after and during the treatment, and just the revolutionary impact, just like the patient I showed in the slide, that it had on her life. And that was a really good piece, as well as it included our chairman, Neil Cassell, talking about the foundation and Focused Ultrasound as well. Next slide. And we're fortunate enough to have John Grisham on our board of directors. So John Grisham, if you didn't know, lives in Charlottesville for many years. And so he got connected to our foundation at the very, very beginning. And he's always been a great board member. And he definitely is a very funny guy too. So he always has the jokes. But he decided several years ago, he thought, what can I do to actually really help grow this field beyond like giving money or hooking up with people that could give money? And he thought, well, I can tell a good story. So he wrote this very short book called The Tumor, and you can get it for free on Amazon or Google Play, Barnes and Noble, download it. And it is really just following a young father who is diagnosed with glioblastoma. And the first chapter is kind of what would happen today. He maybe would have to go through all these treatments, terrible quality of life, and then ultimately he would pass away. The next chapter is what could happen with something like Focused Ultrasound. And eventually he still would die to glioblastoma, but he would have a much better quality of life, fewer side effects. He would live longer. He'd be able to kind of spend that time with his family. And then the end of the book is really just taught like the call to action, come learn about the foundation, get involved. And so there have been over 1 million+ downloads of this book over the last many years. So anyway, if you're interested in that, you can find it on Amazon. Next slide. And we partner with many different disease foundations like the Michael J. Fox Foundation, the Melanoma Research Alliance, again, to find areas where there are clinical applications that these folks are focused on and Focused Ultrasound could potentially treat. And so we'll partner on clinical trials, for instance. Next slide. And we work with, in DC, a lot of what I'm doing is working with all the trade associations, the government regulatory associations, as well as people like the NIH, to again, try to advance Focused Ultrasound as quickly as we can. Next slide. And so we're positioning ourselves at the nexus of all of these stakeholders, as I mentioned, in this complicated ecosystem. Next slide. So ultimately, if you just click one more, at the end of the day, if we weren't here, Focused Ultrasound, we believe, would someday become the standard of care. It would just take quite some time. Next slide, or click again. And so all we're doing with the investment of our dollars, which, as I didn't mention, but our money comes from philanthropists. So mostly, a lot of really high net worth individuals who we're fortunate to be connected to, but just or just normal people who are interested in giving any money to the foundation, but almost all is philanthropic dollars, not from companies or, anything like that. And we're investing those generous donor dollars and our activities, next slide, into moving that curve to the left. So we're really just trying to make focused ultrasound become a standard of care. And I realize in this slide, now we're already at the 2023, and I would say it is becoming closer to standard of care for something like essential tremor. But we have a long way to go in a lot of these other applications. Next slide. So there's just one
When
more
I first
thing.
heard I had Parkinson's, I was
Can you
very
turn this up
surprised.
if possible?
I always thought of it being an older person's illness, and I've always seen people in wheelchairs. So I thought I was going to lose all my mobility. So it was very frightening. Walking I couldn't do because of the dystonia with my toes. I couldn't run. I couldn't go hiking. Basically anything that required movement, I couldn't do it. And my leg would bounce uncontrollably. It would hyperextend and actually lock backwards. It was very, very painful. I couldn't walk, so I had to be taken in a wheelchair to the hospital. With each treatment, I could feel myself getting stronger and stronger. My symptoms were getting less and less, and my pain was getting less. Then the clinical trial director, she looked at me and she says, "Get up, you can walk." And I thought, I can walk. I can walk. I knew I could. It was amazing. I got there in the wheelchair, unable to walk, and immediately following it, I walked to the room. It's a miracle. Focused ultrasound treatment has given me back my life. I've been able to go on walks. I've been able to run. Been able to ride my bike again. It's a miracle.
So Kimberly was treated at the University of Maryland. She was one of the first patients treated there with Parkinson's disease. And you'll notice the shaved head. A lot of people wonder about that. That's just because ultrasound can't go through air, and a lot of air will get in the scalp if you have hair there. So that's what the shaving is for. But there are kind of innovations that are being developed to make it such that you can wear some sort of a cap and you don't have to shave the head, because some people, that's a bothersome thing. They don't want to deal with it. Yeah.
How competitive is the market for creating these machines that are delivering the treatment, and who are the leaders there?
So probably not companies that you've heard of. The biggest company is called Insightec, which is an Israeli-based company. But
If we could save the questions for after, we have to close.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Are we done?
Yeah, that's basically it.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Well done. Well done.
Gary, was piqued the interest of a lot of people in the club, obviously, and he told people about something they've probably never heard of before. So certainly sounds promising, and we hope we will hope success in the field, that we can cure or at least make these diseases much easier to tolerate than they have been. Thank you very much.
Sure.
If you need anybody-